Welcome to Lecture 9. Yes, it is Lecture 9. And people work in organisations. I hope you had a good Christmas and a Happy New Year. I've had a good Christmas in a sense of the word that I have been working furiously throughout. Actually, I took very, very little time off at Christmas. I've got a lot of marking to do. I've done a lot and a lot more to come. I'm not going to release results or send back your assignments until I'm done. And the good news is I'm almost done. So I'm probably 4 or 5 days away from completion. I've got just to give you an idea, I've had to read over 250,000 words just for this subject alone, and write tens of thousands of words in feedback over the course of that time. So it's been a massive job. I have to say I've always get warned, marking's terrible, it's an awful job. I have basically enjoyed it. You've given me a whole range of different kinds of material to consider, and I've learnt a lot from reading it. There has been a number of common errors, and I'll deal with that on the Moodle website in this breaking news forum in the next few days. Also, just to bring that to your attention with the breaking news forum, I'm also going to post up there in the next few days some useful information, definitely useful information about the exam. So I'm going to be giving you a little bit more feedback about the exam, as much as I am allowed to by the university. So keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye on your emails as well. Keep clicking around on the websites and using the material that's available for you there. The other thing I'm duty bound to tell you is that there's a Have Your Say button has appeared on your Moodle website. For those of you who are regular Moodle watchers, that's appeared. That's a very alarming button for me because, whereas I'm in the process of have been providing feedback to you, and I've been tough on you, now comes the moment for you to be tough on me. Of course, really what I want you to be, as I've tried to be, is I want you to be as fair as possible. So if I've done something wrong, I want to find out about it. And if I've done something right, I want to be told about it so that I continue to do the things that are good and stop doing the things that are bad. So that's what evaluation is all about. I want to be able to do a better job next year and next term of this subject, or whenever I do teach it again, and I'll generally learn something about my teaching and what I need to do better. So I do look forward to getting your say, but it's also a somewhat scary process because it is completely anonymous. So you can be as bitchy as you like on there, and there's nothing I can do about it. So unlike my feedback to you, which is totally not anonymous, you know who's given the feedback. Unfortunately, I can't escape. That's life. That's the power differentials, the reversal of power. Okay, let's get on to this week's topic, which is about leadership. Almost the topic we're just talking about, isn't it? So leadership, very broadly, is the ability to influence or motivate others or enable others to contribute towards the effectiveness of organisations of which they are members. Now, it's worth making that distinction. The old style or old understanding of leadership related to this ability to motivate or influence. The more modern style is about enabling and working with staff to achieve something. So we'll be talking about the different types of leadership and how they differ in approach. And, there is quite an interesting difference of views, and it has developed historically quite a bit. Back in the days of the Middle Ages, for example, where the king was simply born into leadership, whether he had the ability, whether he had the charisma or not. Some very uncharismatic individuals became leaders at that time, but they also became quite effective leaders because what they said went. You either did what they wanted, or you died, or were popped in the Great Tower of London, for example, or in equivalent prisons in various countries of the world. So that was absolute power, and that didn't put much stress on leaders to be great leaders in the kind of way that we expect leaders to be great leaders these days. Okay, so we've got a number of different models that the textbook talks about: implicit, transformational, competency, and contingency models. We'll just very quickly give you a quick eyeful of those. Implicit leadership models, they basically are based on the idea that we have these kinds of models in our head of what a good leader should be. And probably for a lot of us, that model might even include male, for example, whether that's right or wrong. These kind of implicit models, prototypes, appear to be somewhat genetic. I'll talk about that a little bit later. They also tend to be kind of like the great man in history theory of leadership. So the role of leader is pivotal in the future of world events and the future of the planet, the future of the organization. Henry Ford was critical to the creation and the prospering of Ford Motor Company, for example. Bill Gates, without Bill, there would have been no Microsoft. That's the kind of view that this particular implicit leadership model tends to support. Then the competency perspective breaks down leadership into different aspects of the individual, and it looks at the characteristics of leaders. It doesn't so much look at these models, these implicit models. It focuses on things like individual differences, the amount of drive for power, drive to be a great leader, or the self-concepts of the great leaders. Then there's the transformational or transactional perspective. These two are not similar, but they're kind of like opposites. They focus on how leaders change organizations, and the transformational leadership model is all about inspiring and creating vision and modeling a vision, whereas transactional talks about using rewards to achieve what you want to do, and the transaction between the leader and the employer, leader and the employee. In a business setting, of course. Contingencies, we all know about those now. We're starting to become comfortable with that term, I hope. Leadership depends on the situation. So there's a number of different contingency models. We'll be talking about a few of them very briefly, but it requires leaders to be flexible in order to be able to adapt to different contingencies within the firm, or within the organisation, or within staff. If you have a different kind of staff, you need to behave differently. That's a contingency perspective. Alrighty, let's start off with the competency or competency perspective. They're both fairly correct pronunciations. Starting off with personality, there's a big literature talking about how certain kinds of the big five, extroversion and conscientiousness, for example, but there's also things like need for power, a need for achievement, personality characteristics associated with leadership. Good leaders tend to be associated with those who have complex, clear, and internally consistent, not vacillating between one thing and another. They also tend to have high self-esteem. They're not people who are depressed, strong sense of self-efficacy or efficacy. You need to be reminded of that, hopefully, or hopefully not. Internal locus of control. Just self-efficacy is the ability to influence the course of events. It's a very powerful concept in psychology. So never underestimate that particular concept. It's a big one. And locus of control. Locus basically means location of control, sense of control. So people who have internal locus of control have a very strong sense that they can, that when things happen, it's because of them. They can influence them. Very closely related to self-efficacy, but somewhat different, because you can have external locus of control as well, where if you've got employees who've got high external locus of control, they have a kind of helpless sense that, what will be, will be. They may look at astrology, for example, astrology columns to see how the day is going to be at work. Whereas internal locus of control, people think, well, I'm going to make things happen at work today. Intelligence, the kind of intelligence we're looking at for leaders, tends to be this practical, real-world intelligence, where they're comfortable with understanding how projects work, and they can quickly amalgamate lots of different options into a single concept and make decisions using that kind of intelligence. Emotional intelligence, we've dealt with this, but look, it's the ability to perceive emotions, express emotions, and also regulate their own emotions and regulate other people's emotions. They have emotional manipulation skill inside themselves and outside themselves. Really, really handy to have, because a lot of performance, as we've talked about previously, is related to emotions. And so emotional intelligence enables you to manipulate those emotions within yourself. I'm very interested in working in a particular area of emotional intelligence to do with performance. And one of the things that I tend to emphasize, and something that you can use as a student, is the risk and the advantages of using coffee and alcohol to regulate your emotion. Most of us use these two liquids quite ineffectively. We tend to drink at the inappropriate times when we probably need to take control of our emotions in difficult circumstances, or we might increase our levels of arousal with coffee when our arousal levels are probably high enough as they are. So, for example, if you're feeling highly keyed up before an exam, strongly recommend against taking coffee unless you desperately need it to get rid of a headache. But you don't need to be further up when you're already up. So that's a kind of mechanical form of emotional regulation, but it does give you an idea of why it's important to be able to regulate emotions. And we've talked about drive. It's related to conscientiousness, which is one of those personality characteristics and positive self-concept. But the driven reader has a high need for achievement, different to a high need for power. It tends to drive this inquisitiveness, risk-taking, action orientation rather than passivity. Integrity. Now, I did wanted to point out that for those of you who are very good political operators, there's this very strong body of evidence suggesting that one of the most important characteristics of effective leaders is integrity, which is great because it's going to drive people to have greater integrity in their work. Ironically, there's also literature suggesting that people who get promoted, they're not necessarily very good leaders, but they're very good at getting promoted, tend to be ones who aren't that high in integrity and are great at doing the politics within an organization. That's kind of a flip side to it and kind of depressing result. But we're talking about leaders who are actually good at their work, getting the organization to achieve things. And integrity is one of the most important characteristics of a good leader. Good news. So knowledge of the business, business-specific knowledge. So if you're in the software business, having a good concept of the software business does help make you a good leader. It's surprisingly unimportant. There are many, many great managers who do not have the skills of their business, but they are great people managers. They're great inspirers. They're great big picture concept people. And they can still be very good leaders without having that precise knowledge of the business. But there is a flip side to this. And the example I gave in class today, for example, relates to, for example, my brother, who's a veterinary surgeon, quite an excellent veterinary surgeon, has worked in relatively or very large hospitals, both at universities and in private business. And he made the point that there's been kind of like it's generally known that veterinary practices are very poorly managed generally by non-vets. Same with medical practices. Vets are professionals. They don't like to be led by non-professionals. They like the sense that the boss also knows how to cut up a cow, perform an operation on a cat, etc., etc. So there is that kind of knowledge of business and its importance. And then there's this motivation to be a leader is an important characteristic, the want to be a boss. But it's for reasons of socialized power, that is to do something good for the organization, not personalized power, even though, of course, it often comes down to that. Now, authentic leaders are the kinds that do it for the right reason. They tend to be those who know themselves, they are themselves, and they listen to others. Some of the common characteristics associated with them are, things like values, honesty, passion, trust. and receptivity to feedback, which is a particularly important element of modern management. You need to be strong enough to be able to take criticism. You need to be strong enough to be able to listen to feedback, even though your mindset, your implicit model of leadership may be very old-fashioned, and mine is one like that, where boss knows best, etc., etc. You need to suppress that in order to be a good, authentic leader. Not easy to do, but let's say in relation to the feedback you're going to give me through that red button, I need to be strong enough to look at that honestly, and because otherwise I will not be able to improve. Narcissistic leaders. Unfortunately, this is a common characteristic of leaders, and I got this lovely picture of Napoleon there, dressed in his finery, a man who really did have a solidly high opinion of himself. And Narcissus was the Greek god, of course, who fell in love with his image in a mirror. Might have been not even a Greek god, just a Greek lad, I think. Good-looking lad, no doubt, who loved himself too much. I think he died from not being able to drag himself away from the mirror. I think that was the story, something like that. Great story. Now, charismatic leaders, those transformational leaders, they tend to fall into this trap, because they are charismatic, because they have a high degree of ability to ingratiate themselves into followers. They themselves start to fall in love with themselves. And it's often associated with overconfidence, which can be a really genuinely bad thing. Like when Napoleon marched on Moscow, that was a bridge too far. He thought he was invincible. He most certainly was not. Abuse of power, like Stalin, for example, on the opposite side of that particular political divide, they reach a point where they are certain of their own importance, their own infallibility, and they start to abuse power. And it's a common trap. This competency perspective has undergone a revival, but its sources are that great man in history period, but it tends to ignore the context, the importance of context in good leadership, because good leadership may depend indeed on having good followers. If you've got bad staff, it doesn't matter how good leaders you are, you can't transform them completely. And also it's this kind of acceptance that there may be more than one way to be excellent. It assumes that leadership is also a born characteristic rather than one that can develop, which is kind of like a negative assumption of the model. And it's probably also not accurate because there is evidence that leadership can be trained, not completely. There's certain things, if you're a completely tongue-tied, incurably shy person, your leadership is probably going to be pretty limited. Talk about that in a minute as well. Okay, the contingency perspective. The idea that good leadership depends on certain things, are contingent on certain things. One of the better supported models is path goal theory, and it does the literature tends to show, where it compares this particular form with transformational leadership, it tends to show that this is a more effective general model. I hope my volume levels aren't fluctuating too much, because I've got this, I've lost my other microphone or can't find it today. Okay, so it's based on the expectancy theory of motivation that basically breaks down leadership styles into two types, employee and situational. And a great quote from McShane, I've put there, effective leaders ensure that employees who perform their jobs well received more valued rewards. So you match your rewards with those who do an effective job for the organization to try and make sure the path to the goal is smooth, well-defined, unambiguous, and properly rewarded. So good leaders ensure that they try to help, and this is the servant leadership model that's coming out here. They try to help good staff succeed by ensuring they have access to the right training, the right support and resources. This servant leadership thing sees leaders not as being slaves of to use the biblical expression, the child is father of the man, which is kind of almost what we're saying here. But really, just to be clear, servant leadership relates to a view of power that that says that your job is to facilitate the success of the organisation and to help your employees to achieve what they need to achieve for the good of the organisation. So in that sense, your employees are your bosses. So we'll look quickly at some leadership styles from this particular model. There's the directive style, supportive style, participative, and achievement orientated. Directive is kind of like authoritative, telling people what to do. Supportive is like the counselor role, where you help reduce anxiety and over-anxious staff and encourage ones that are feeling a little low in self-esteem. Participative, we're all in this together. I may have the Rolls Royce parked out the back, but we're all in this together. Achievement orientated, help staff achieve their potential. You set goals, you provide rewards that are aimed at achieving peak performance, and you use your confidence in staff as a tool to achieve those results. Now, path goal model assumes that leaders will be flexible enough to be able to choose the most appropriate style for a particular situation. So, 4 different types of leadership, 3 different kinds of outcomes is the basic thing, but there are some contingencies. And let's have a quick look at 2 of those contingencies. Environmental contingencies, for example. I won't go into each of these, but so where task structure is there's a mistake there. Where task structure is routine, boring, in other words, everything's the same, routine, not non-routine. Directive style, telling people what to do, helps to clarify the whole thing. With inexperienced, actually I've got this wrong, so I'll just explain it without looking at the slides. Please just ignore the slide for a moment. If a job is complex and you've got inexperienced staff, then you need to be quite directive. If the job is complex, you've got experienced staff, you can go for supportive. You don't want to tell people how to suck eggs if they're already highly experienced at sucking eggs, to use a common English expression. For those of you for whom English is not the first language, I apologise for the nature of English. It can be strange. Or participative leadership helps for non-routine tasks, helps staff work out the best plan for reaching goals, working together with you, kind of thing. And some employee contingencies. So just to give an example, people with external locus of control work better with directive leadership. Just to make that clear, if you come to work with a model in your head that life is all about fate and what happens to you, you don't have a lot of role in making things happen. You've got an external locus of control. You're the type of person who's going to naturally be inclined towards directive or supportive leadership, certainly directive. So that's one of those employee contingency, the path goal model. Gives you a bit of a couple of examples. Some other contingency theories and models, Fiedlers, which was one of the first. It suggests that the best leadership style depends on the level of situational control. There's basically 2 types, task and people oriented. It also suggests that it depends on leader-member relations, task structure, position power, the degree to which leader has legitimate authority over the organisation. So when a leader has good leader-member relations, high task structure, and strong position power, things will go well. It has been criticised because leader-member relations is like almost it's almost an individual difference factor rather than a situational factor. But it has been credited with opening it up, the whole leadership literature, to a whole series of different contingency models, and it has probably not stood the test of time, but it has helped stimulate a whole field, a quite successful field. I'll just zoom in on the Blanchard model. Its assumption is that followers are either ready or not ready to complete a task, and if they're ready, then all you need to do is be high in task orientation. If they're not ready, if they are ready but they're not willing, you need to be supportive and participative. Lead the way, help them go and do it. If they're ready and willing, rather obvious, leaders can just sit back and enjoy it. It's all going to happen for them. It suggests there are 4 styles, look at that spelling mistake, 4 styles of leader: telling, selling, participating, and delegating. So there's only one part of the model that has been shown to really work quite well, and that is the telling style. Tends to work when employees lack motivation and ability. It's quite similar to the directive style for path goal theory, and I just, in the contingencies that I talked about, I actually said much the same thing as what's come out of this particular model, the situational leadership model. I want to talk about another contingency here, a particularly good one. Talking about a particular individual characteristic called introversion.
Welcome to the HBR IdeaCast from Harvard Business Review. I'm Sarah Green. I'm talking today with Francesca Gino, an associate professor at Harvard Business School, who is the co-author of the December 2010 article, The Hidden Advantages of Quiet Bosses. Francesca, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So the research that you did with Adam Grant and David Hoffman shows that despite what we may assume, extroverts aren't always the best bosses. Did this finding surprise you?
Yes, it did a little bit. We were looking for situations in which introverts could do better, and we were successful in finding one, as situations in which you have followers were proactive.
So what kinds of experiments did you do to uncover this?
I love that she asked this question.
In the research, we did both a field study and lab studies. In the field study, we used the survey methods. So we sent surveys to different pizza stores. And we had ratings of the leaders and a sense of whether they were extroverted or introverted. And we also had ratings of the followers for their proactive behaviors. And what's nice about that setting is that we could look at performance in terms of profits for the stores. And in the lab setting, instead, we brought people into the lab and put them in situations where they were either leaders or followers. And again, we tried to figure out whether matching proactive followers with extroverted leaders would actually lead to better performance for the group.
Now, I'll pause there, and in fact, I'll just explain a few things and we'll move on. But you can get this one off YouTube if you like. I wanted to bring this to your attention for a number of reasons. First of all, a great example of contingency. So we said that, traditionally the view is that extroverted leaders tend to be the best leaders. The ones that are talkative, the ones that are social, the ones that like getting on with people, etc., extroversion. But this particular researcher and her team identified that there are some occasions where extroverted leaders do not produce optimal results for the organization, and that introversion can be better. And that is where your employees are proactive. So if you've got self-driven, self-motivated, self-leading individuals within your organization, the extroverted style can be off-putting. That's effectively what the experiment suggests. The other reason I wanted to bring this to your attention is because this is an excellent example of a study. It's got 2 different kinds of method of proving something, if you like, and I quickly jump in on myself to say, don't use the word proving generally in social science. It's not a good thing because there is no proof of anything. No absolute proof, and also do not use absolute kinds of words. It's not a so when you're writing essays, etc., for university, try to sound a little bit more cautious and couched in your approach. But I also want you to remember for future essays, when you're presenting evidence from journals, and you'll be encouraged to do that in future courses at CQU, I urge you to try to weigh up the quality of an experiment. Not just read something, take it as gospel, and put it in your essay references in the Harvard style and think you're done. I mean, that's good enough to get passes, good enough even to get distinctions, really, but it isn't great. And you'll impress your lecturers, impress your markers, by showing you have the ability to weigh up evidence. Now, quickly, in relation to this, I don't want to go on too long. This lady and her team, they did two different kinds of study, a laboratory study and a field study in real pizza shops. And both those studies came up with the same outcome. So that's good quality. Secondly, in the pizza studies, what they did was they asked the employees about their own personality. Are you proactive or not proactive? And they used these questionnaires and surveys with their strengths and weaknesses for this type of survey. And then they also measured the extroversion, introversion of the leaders within the pizza shops. And then, and this is really good, they actually measured pizza productivity and productivity of the different pizza stores and compared that with the degree of match between leadership style and employee characteristics. Then they also took the same concepts and used the advantages of a laboratory study, which is that you can control the variables very neatly. It's not very real world, but you can control things very neatly within the laboratory. This is why I love organizational behavior. This is why I love psychology, is that it's very good at this type of thing. A good quality study does advance human knowledge in this way, and I trust this result. Because of the quality with which the research that backs it. And as you develop through your degree, I strongly urge you to become a good consumer of research, a good critic, and begin to weigh up evidence and don't just blindly go with what the textbook says. I mean, of course, textbooks are good at weighing up evidence, but become your own personal critic of the content. I went on a little bit long there. Let's talk about transformational, transactional leadership. Now, transformational, we've talked about a fair bit. Transaction is where you exchange one thing for another. So it tends to be contingent on rewards. So it's really a form of contingency theory. And it involves management by exception. So without going into this active and passive business, it relates to, management hovers and looks for problems and intervenes when there is a problem, or looks for performance and intervenes when there's great performance, for example. It tends to not be very interventionist. It tends to be, to use the French expression, laissez-faire, let everything be. It avoids direct decisions and direct leadership, and it's a lot more standoffish. Whereas transformational is really the leading rather than just managing and controlling things in that sort of bureaucratic way. It really involves wanting to make a change, impose a change. And it's worth remembering that, I'll just zoom in there, a couple of points. It's, transformational and charisma is very, very similar. It relates to personal traits or individual characteristics. Traits are a good word for you to keep in mind for the exam. Individual difference is another good term. And look, it has been linked widely to performance and job satisfaction, particularly in smaller companies. So it is a good thing, transformational leadership, but it doesn't necessarily transform the organization. I mean, take the leader out, and you'll find suddenly the organization's back to whatever it was before the leader arrived, which isn't a particularly permanent kind of change, durable kind of change. So it relates to a set of behaviors as much as personality characteristics. Though the charisma school it's a personality characteristics such as JFK. Now, the transformational leadership, just to make this distinction, tends to relate strongly to the ability to have a vision and communicate that vision, whereas charisma has these extra two elements, which you'll see in great charismatic leaderships in biographical studies, for example, which is sensitivity to followers' needs. I'm in the trenches with you. And this sense of risk, sacrifice, and unconventional behavior, which is a curious one, but comes up in the literature, is that, charismatic leaders tend to be odd people and prepared to take personal risks and prepared to be different and are not a part of the crowd. So the implicit readership perspective, we're getting to the meaty end of the whole show. Mind you, it's 34 minutes, so we really do want to get to it. It focuses on, perceptions, as we said, people's models or prototypes of leaders. So we have these ideas in our head about leaders. We're often born with them. They're developed also through socialization. So just in relation to the born with them, I thought I'd mention that there is evidence that right and left in politics, for example, is something that we are to some degree born with. It's also, we tend to vote the way our parents vote, so there is also a socialization element to it. But with this inherited aspect, they found, for example, that people who tend to vote on the right of politics, particularly the far right of politics, voting, for for example, Pauline Hanson, in terms of the Australian politics, people who vote for that end of politics tend to have a stronger need for strong leaders. They like to have decisive, strong leadership, and that appears to be a to some degree, genetic characteristic. And these prototypes, these idea that there are prototypes in the head has been backed by research. There is evidence of it. The assumption number 2 is that we romanticize leadership. We tend to have an urge to believe that leaders can make a difference. It's probably because it's a handy schema or way of thinking about the world, and it also is kind of like it fits in with this idea that great men in history, that people can make a difference, individuals can make a difference. Adolf Hitler transformed Germany in a bad way, or that Winston Churchill changed Britain in a good way, for example. It's all about this fundamental attribution error. So, it's an assumption, this implicit model, but it is wrong. I'm not saying absolutely wrong. People do make a difference, but we tend to excessively blame or credit the individual rather than the situation in relation to these implicit models. So some big questions. Can we do without leaders? Will a nicely organized business run itself? And the example that I would like you to go to is the example of Semco, the Brazilian company, which I tried to draw you to before, but Google Semco and see what you come up with. Can you manage, even if you don't want your business to run for yourself? And a lot of people, as leaders or managers, have very strong egos, and they want to make a difference to an organization. They want it to be in their own image, so to speak. But increasingly, as businesses grow, you can't be everywhere. Bill Gates cannot be at the Brisbane branch of Microsoft, or the Sydney branch, or the Perth branch. You have to rely on remote leadership or staff that you've delegated to. And so then comes the question for the leader: can you actually pick good leaders, or can you train good leaders within your organization? Certainly a worthwhile skill to have is to be able to pick people who will carry out the vision that you have. And getting close to the end here. In fact, I'm not 100% sure what we've got still to go. I just want to say a few words about this little graphic here, but I need to get this right. It's kind of complicated. One of the questions we need to ask ourselves is leadership something that we attribute to people who succeed, or do people who are good leaders succeed? And that sounds subtle, but let's take the example of Bill Gates. Do we say Bill is a great leader because he's a great leader? Or do we say Bill's a great leader because he owns Microsoft? It's possible that the reason we pick people as good leaders is because they have succeeded, not that they have succeeded because they're good leaders. That's kind of what I'm trying to say there. Looking at this idea of shared leadership then is becoming an increasingly popular norm within organisational studies, and the whole view of employees also being capable of being leaders. Particularly this kind of model develops when bosses are prepared to share, the glory, and there's a collaborative, more flatter culture within an organisation. And the team enthusiastically evangelizes, or the management team and that enthusiastically evangelizes and persuades others to come on board. So leadership substitutes theory, it's also a contingency theory, suggests that there's certain conditions that limit the value of leaders or renders them unnecessary. For example, if you've got very good performance-based reward systems in place, leaders can become kind of pointless. If you've accurately attached quality outcomes, safety outcomes, production outcomes to reward systems, you may have destroyed people's inherent intrinsic motivation to do things, but you will have a system that virtually perfectly does as it's told without people having to be told. And it's also this issue of leadership substitutes theory, is that there are very high, we talked about proactivity from that Harvard study, highly skilled, proactive, or self-directed employees, they have less need for task-orientated leadership or micromanagement, to use another term. There's very little research done in this area, but some final thoughts. So on ethical leadership, it's becoming increasingly important, and it's related to OCBs, organizational citizenship behaviors increasing, improvement in trust, improvement in commitment, lower turnover of staff. So it is a key importance. Ethical leadership is associated with high agreeableness, which is basically like niceness, if you like, and conscientiousness. I just wanted to show you the corruption index, which there's a reference, and this relates to ethical leaders. Australia is doing pretty well, and North Korea is doing pretty badly in terms of corruption. So there's countries, when you're dealing with countries on an international basis, you need to be aware of differences in structural ethics, the context. It's very difficult, for example, in countries that are quite corrupt, to have ethical leadership, because it simply won't work in certain in certain circumstances, in certain countries. And you need to implement special procedures and not just simply assume that everything will be so. So, cross-cultural issues. The textbook talks about Project Globe, which looked at leadership in 150 different countries. They looked at things like vision, foresight, encouragement. They found these are the principles that are universally supported as good leadership characteristics. Ability to encourage and have trust and dynamism and positiveness, proactiveness, self-leadership. They tend to be quite universal. In other words, the charismatic model of leadership is quite a universal implicit leadership model. So it's an international thing. It must be built in, I would guess, it must be built into the way that humans are. There are differences in power distance, which you remember is that degree to which people accept differences between leaders, a gap in power between a leader and a follower. Differences in power distance mean that expectations in different countries differ as to whether directive or participative leadership models are appropriate or not. Finally, gender. Women do adopt more participatory leadership styles. They're more flatter leadership style, collaborative, and they use more coaching, empowering, and team style. Possibly because that's the way we expect women to behave, so that's the way they do behave. That's my telephone going, so just ignore that for a moment. Possibly socialization of women to try to avoid high power, high status positions. Women tend to be regarded as less feminine if they behave in that way. And also possibly because women actually have this innate capacity to be more collaborative and understand social issues and have a higher emotional intelligence, for example. It's another possible reason. But basically, men and women leaders do not differ in the degree to which they're task or people orientated. That's what the evidence tends to show. We're done. 44 minutes. This is the longest yet. Happy New Year in a kind of ironic sense. And talk to you next week.